And I actually have broken with the IDSA tradition. Usually the coordinators speak at the end and give a vote of thanks. But I thought it was important to basically lay out the conceptual structure of the conference so that we keep that in mind when we are presenting. So what I have done is I've tried to identify the issues that were with us at IDSA that we thought is important to bring to bear when we are talking about India's approach and also comprehending it. Now, the title comprehending is because in many of the inputs that we got from people from outside or whenever we presented outside of India, is that it was very difficult to identify what exactly is India's strategic approach to issues and challenges and opportunities, as the chair was mentioning. So I thought, so it's a very interesting platform to actually comprehend what could be or what is the best approach, if not the only approach, towards particular strategic opportunities and challenges. So in terms of the paper presentation, so what I've titled it as India's Strategic Approach to Asia, and I'm going to identify the key questions, which Brigitte Daya has already referred, but I'll just reiterate so that we keep that in mind when we're presenting. I think when I observe Indian foreign policy or India's strategic approaches, I think it has evolved over the years from the 1940s to now where we are. In fact, what is interesting is that just before this conference, we had a very, I think, successful visit by President Barack Obama. And what was very fascinating to me was to watch that India and the US actually signed a declaration of friendship, and which identified certain issues that both countries would deal with. And I think what also would be, what I would bring to bear is that if you go to last year's visit by Prime Minister Modi, he had also identified, he and Barack Obama had written an op-ed in the Washington Post where they had identified issues which are important for both countries. And that gives us a particular perspective of where India wants to go, or what is it that India sees as a challenge or an opportunity. And I think the other interesting document that came out, now one of the main criticisms that always come to us, especially those who work on strategic issues in India, is that India doesn't have a national security strategy document or doesn't have white papers. But I think what is fascinating is that in the last few years we do have joint statements. We have identified certain vision statements, and so one of the statements which came out also of the Obama visit was the vision for the Asia Pacific. And what is interesting is that I'll read out this para to you, which I think would give you an idea. So in the statement, there was a particular identification of challenges, and one was, we affirm the importance of safeguarding maritime security and ensuring freedom of navigation and overflight throughout the region, the Asian region, especially with the South China Sea. We call out on all parties to avoid the threat or use of force and pursue resolution of territorial or maritime disputes. And what is important is that both leaders identified the freedom of seas as an important factor, which is in line with the inaugural address today. So I thought that is fascinating. But despite that, and now this is where the criticality of this conference comes in, is that despite these statements in recent years, there is still a lot of criticism from people who watch India from outside. And I think what comes out in the literature review that I have done is that it starts since the 1990s. And one of the essays which most of my Indian colleagues will very well know about is a famous essay by George Tantum. We all know about it. But then for those who have probably read it much before, I would like to reiterate what he said. So George Tantum had written this essay which influenced Indian thinking, and actually many people argued against it, but it's still important to remember what he said. So this essay was published in 1992 called Indian Strategic Thought, an Interpretive Essay. So what Tantum argued is that despite there being a lot of different arguments on issues and challenges that India faced, and remember this is in the context of the 1990s when India just liberalized in 1991. But he said that in his interviews that he conducted, he couldn't find a coherent set of ideas that actually articulated India's vision or what India wants to be or what India aspires for. And the key question that Tantum actually addressed were what is the role that India would play in Asia? And of course, he was also identifying issues and challenges for the United States, basically. He works for RAND Corporation. So he argued that what is it that the United States would actually perceive as of India playing a role in Asia of a security provider, and what are the opportunities that there could be. But the problem is, he argued that there are 4 reasons why strategic culture was missing in India. One was, of course, the fact that India's identity itself was very difficult to identify in terms of politics. And I mean, we can disagree with that, but it's important to remember what he said. He said that because the identification of India is more cultural, and not political. So that's why maybe there is a lack of continuity in strategic thinking. He did identify the Mughals, the Gupta period, but he said that those were limited to a particular geographical aspect of India and did not include the whole of India. The second thing which Tantum argued is that because of a lack of written history, so he couldn't collect documents which went very, very forward, and because of a tradition of oral history, maybe there was a missing. But what he said is that since the 1850s, there was a great resurgence of Indian nationalism, a pride in India, and so there was a relook at Indian history. And then the other very fascinating argument, which I think holds true today too, is that he said that the important thing to remember is that the size of India and the fact that India is such a huge continent actually limits India's external view, because it's very important for India to look inward and keep the country united, progressive, and developed. So maybe that's another reason why India did not look externally for so long. And then he actually says that the British were the first empire which actually came to India, colonized India, and thought about ideas like maritime strategy, strategic defense. And what he actually delineated is that this came from the British own understanding that they came to India because of one vulnerability, and that is India's inability to protect the seas. And so they landed in the shores of India. So this is what he says. And what is also interesting is that, and which I think I relate to, is that given that particular land vulnerability from the northwest of India, where you had invasions throughout history, and because of the vulnerability of the seas, so India's strategic outlook is defensive. So India is very defensive. It wants to defend the huge territory it has, protect itself, and ensure that there is progress, which actually is correct, because we do have a lot of internal issues, and I think it still holds true today. But what I found very intriguing is that this did not stop in the 1990s. So last year, in 2013, when I was visiting United States Institute of Peace as a senior fellow, 2 articles were shown to me by my colleagues in Washington, D.C., saying that, look, you should read these articles and see what The Economist is saying about India. So these 2 articles, the first one is, of course, which really made a huge impact on those looking at India from there, is India as a great power, know your own strength. And the second article was, can India become a great power? So what the articles actually identified as India's weakness is a striking lack of strategic culture. So they argued that India's aspirations towards becoming a great power are undermined by its sheer lack of strategic thinking and planning, especially a deeply thought through process based on future goals and ambitions supported by capability. The articles caution that with a neighborhood that is dangerous, with jihadi violence, with the rise of China, with the possession of nuclear weapons, and also China claiming territorial areas in India, this lack of strategic culture might actually weaken India's capability to defend itself. And then the recommendation of The Economist is interesting to me. So they say that one way that India can actually go about becoming a great power is to join a Western alliance. So I found that difficult to digest, but that was there. And it's important because it's a recommendation made, and which had influenced, by the way, these articles. Now, the other thing which I think we need to debate in the conference very seriously is assertion by The Economist again, that basically that there is a problem between a civil-military relationship that is not very wonderfully symbiotic. There are problems between the civilian and the military structures. And then they argue that the capacity of ministries like those dealing with external affairs is limited. And so with 2 hotly disputed borders, India has much to lose by this lack of interest in matters strategic. And I think now I'll take on, of course I'll offer you my view on this, but I'm just reiterating so that we keep that in mind. And I think one of the para which I would like to read out for you, and which I think is important, is that it argues that basically the Indians or Indian strategic analyst, the Ministry of Defense, everybody else who's included in that particular structure, shows very little interest in military or strategic issues. Strategic defense reviews like those that take place in America, Britain, and France, informed by serving officers and civil servants but led by politicians, are unknown in India. The armed forces regard the Ministry of Defense as woefully ignorant of military matters, with a few of the skills needed to provide support in areas such as logistics and procurement. And then they say that this is also because of a lack of capacity. Now, when I read those articles, I thought that some of the recommendations made by the Economist were valid in terms of India's defensive outlook, in terms of in terms of capability. But I think what is important to understand is that I think what the Economist articles basically were arguing, that it's important for India to join military alliances, Western-backed alliances, to become a great power. But I think what is important to keep in mind is that I think when you trace Indian strategic culture, and I'll say what is it that they are mixing up, culture and planning. So I think what you realize is that India probably gives priority to dialogue over the use of military power in foreign policy, but that does not mean that it does not have a strategic culture. It just means that the strategic preferences are different from the normal understanding of how great powers behave. So basically, that probably is one of the reasons why they say India doesn't have a strategic culture. Now, needless to say, but critical to understand, is the fact that when India emerged as an independent nation in 1947, its economy was weak and it did not possess the military capability, hard power, which they are talking about, to influence world events like some other countries possess, for instance, the United States of America or USSR. Hence, this is my belief, is that it's rather visionary for some of its founding members like Jawaharlal Nehru to use intellect and ideas to launch India onto the world stage based on a power of emancipatory vision of political life, normative power, which we now term as soft power, Joseph Nye's famous argument about how countries need to use soft power. And I think in that, if you should place yourself in the context of 1947, a country that has just become independent, doesn't have a very strong military, is trying to become a new nation. Despite that, I think Nehru's desire to project India actually succeeded, because India did get projected. And I think one of the misunderstanding about the non-alignment is that it's basically a weak strategy. It's because India doesn't want to belong to any kind of bloc. But I think that non-alignment actually served India well in the 1940s and 50s, because I think what Nehru's understanding was, if you look at his papers and articulation, is that he didn't want to limit India's capacity as a new state, and in terms of placing India in the context of the Cold War. If you remember, the structure of international politics was dominated by two very important superpowers. So if you join the Cold War bloc, you have to take sides. But he didn't want India to do that, and so he actually developed a capacity for India to function independently. And I think it's an important reminder given the context in which this was happening. Now, again, coming back to the assertions of The Economist, I think it's important to understand that I think what I understand by strategic culture is just how elites perceive threats and opportunities. And I think The Economist authors more or less perceive what that fundamental Indian strategic culture is. I think they just appear not to like it. And that is because their recommendation is that India needs to be more militarily interventionist, needs to get more out into the world in terms of military hard power, and I think that is one of the problems. I think what I would argue is that India may lack a plan explicit enough to satisfy these observers or complain that its strategy is not what they want. But I think what they are mistaking is that I think what they actually want to say is not that Indian elites or Indian strategic thinkers or military, I'm sure Indian military does a great assessment of threats and challenges, maps the environment, looks at what could be the possible responses. But I think what they actually are arguing is strategic planning, that is very, very concrete steps. And what is the end goal that India wants to achieve? We did hear from the Indian Naval Chief about what is Indian Navy's desire, that is to have a peaceful Indian Ocean, but then the concrete steps to get there and time plots and sequences. I think that is where I think we need to basically shore up our capacity. And I think what I would also like to bring to bear that in the last few years, if not in the 1940s or the 50s, is that we do have publications and a lot of debate on what are the different strategic futures. And I think two organizations that have done this very well is, of course, the Defense Research and Development Organization, which has published a particular publication on alternate futures 2030, and that's published already. The IDSA had 2 books which were on Asian 2030, looking at scenarios for India right up to 2030 and what are the plans and interventions that one needs to do. So there is a change in terms of evolution of Indian strategic thinking. Now let me just quickly tell you how I would place the different thinking in terms of strategy. I think there are 2 very dominant streams that are emerging today in terms of Indian strategic culture. One is, of course, the realist school, school, and the other is what I would generally term as the Nehruvian school of thought. And I think there is a bit of tension between both in terms of who would take center stage. And I think in terms of hardcore realism, the projection of military power beyond Indian borders would improve India's international influence and secure its borders vis-à-vis China and Pakistan. Realists view the instability of Pakistan, the rising power of China, and the unresolved border issue as serious external threats, mitigated by broadcasting efficient and effective military power, especially at the border with Pakistan and China, and projecting Indian naval power into the Indian Ocean. I think it really support increased defense spending, which the economist's own admission is that India is the fourth largest exporter today. And so this is basically a realist stream of thought that is coming to center stage now. I think what is also important to remember is that that's not the only thinking. If you look at if you map Indian strategic culture, there's also an important strategic thinking process which is dominated by what I call the Nehruvian commitment to use military power only as a last resort, not until the last diplomatic note has been written. Nehruvians firmly believe that dialogue rather than military force is the best way to resolve conflicts with either Pakistan or China. They have faith in the ability of international organizations to mitigate international conflicts and are very wary. And so whenever you look at India and even India's behavior today, this influence is still strong because I think there is still a wariness to join security alliances because of what it would indicate in terms of an image for India, given its own history of colonial an assertion against colonialism, its own history of nonviolence. So there is this very interesting two different strands of thought that comes in and influences India's strategic thinking. Now, I think what is also important to understand is that for Nehruvians, military power and military power projection is important, but only as an act of self-defense. And if you remember the speeches that Nehru gave, only under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. So it's a very clear identification of which organization has the legitimacy. But then there is this very interesting competing strands of thoughts that come in. And then there are also the neoliberal school, which talks about the importance of economy in India's outreach, how economy is the goal. Because I'll tell you why, because I think, for instance, coming from areas which are not very developed, I can understand why India also hesitates to go forward and kind of project itself in a much more committed way, because there are so many internal problems too inside. For instance, Northeast insurgencies, Naxalism, J&K. So that limits the capacity of the state. And it's still actually in a process of evolution of its own nation building process. And that has to be kept in mind. Now, before I conclude, I think what I would also argue is that if you see my paper, I've identified certain objectives and priority areas, which I think we'll discuss in the conference. One is, of course, the issue of Central Asia and Afghanistan, which my colleague from Israel will talk about. And then we have South Asia, China, and then we'll be talking about maritime security in Asia. And I think I'll end by just identifying the key questions again. And this is not, please keep in mind that this is just my interpretation of what India's strategic culture is, or the different approaches. We would be delighted to hear from the participants and the audience a different approach, a different idea, a challenge to what I have said, because this conference is about getting different ideas and kind of rethinking on what India's approach would be, especially where India is today in terms of its power, capability, and its economic resources. And I think I'll also reiterate in the end the thematic questions. So one thing that as conference organizers we are looking for from the participants and also from the audience is that what role can India play in shaping the structural and normative parameters for Asian security? I think why this question came about is because whenever our colleagues, or even when I presented outside, especially outside of India, there was always this desire to know what is India willing to do in terms of shaping Asian architecture, and in terms of shaping Asian future, or in terms of looking at opportunities. What is it that India is willing to invest? It's not just ideas and rhetoric, but what is it willing to invest? So it's a very important question that we need to think of. The other thing is, what is India's strategic preference in terms of what Asia's future should be? I think the simplistic answer would be, of course, peaceful. But then how do you get there? How do you get to a world that is peaceful given the turmoil in West Asia, the rise of so many different non-state actors, the rise of other countries who might not like your vision of the future? So how do you maneuver? And I think it's an important question to keep in mind. And finally, I think I look forward to Professor Muni's presentation too, because I think one thing which most observers of India actually argue is that India still sees itself as a South Asian power. It has not actually transcended the identity of South Asia, but then it has aspirations to become a great power. But then with great power also comes responsibility. And I think Professor Barry Buzan will talk about that tomorrow. And so we are looking forward to the conference, and thank you for your listening. Thank you.